You are a peasant in Russia, 1913. You grew up in a village of 300 people. You work the entire day in the fields, and today is the beginning of the harvest. For 6 days out of the week, you work for no pay, and to work on the landlord's fields, you pay rent annually. This rent constitutes 50% of your yearly income. You spend what limited free time you have to work on your allotted plot of land, distributed through the local village community. The field is too small to simultaneously sell enough produce, feed your growing family, and still keep your contribution to the local village sufficient. The village has none of the infrastructure of modern life. It has no electricity, no running water, and no sewage system. Disease is rampant. Your wife gives birth to a son, but dies in childbirth due to there being no doctors in the area. But you couldn't even afford one, if there was. The next year, the Great War breaks out. You are conscripted into the army, rushed through basic training and sent to the front. You spend months shivering in cold trenches, drenched in rainwater, eating what little rations you're given by high command. Your commanding officers eat luxurious feasts, dining with their rich school friends in comfortable, heated buildings. You die in this war, not due to any stray bullet or unlucky artillery explosion, but to starvation and disease. This was life for 80% of Russians before the Soviet Union. The suffering was widespread and constant. Why were things like this? And how did this peasant backwater become a world superpower in a single generation? To understand how Russia fell into this condition, we must examine a period of roughly 300 years, during which the increasingly corrupt Romanov dynasty had been usurped by a family that was not even from Russia. Moreover, it was this foreign encroachment by capital and increasing decadence by the monarchy that represented Russia's deterioration outward into the countryside. By 1913, foreign investors held 49.7% of Russian government debt, and owned nearly 100% of all petroleum fields, 90% of mines, and 40% of metallurgical industries. This foreign debt was administered largely through surpluses extracted from the village commune, the mir, which held the land and divided it into thin strips that it reshuffled every few years. A single household might work dozens of these scattered bands. And because the commune could reassign them at any time, no one could reason to drain, fence, or improve the soil beneath its feet. The wooden plow and the three-field rotation, which Western Europe abandoned in favor of more effective techniques, survived in Russia because the system rewarded standing still. While Europe and America became industrial superpowers, Russia, still ruled by these foreign emperors, stagnated in semi-feudal misery. Although Europe had liberated its peasants hundreds of years ago, Russia was still debating serfdom well into the 19th century. This backwardness of the mode of production led to widespread social discontent and inefficiencies, causing constant famines and suffering on a massive scale. The abolition of serfdom in 1861 did not truly liberate the countryside. Former serfs received legal freedom, but often not enough land to survive independently, and they were burdened with rents, taxes, and other duties. Land ownership also remained extremely unequal. A tiny elite, often summarized as around 1.5% of the population, owned roughly a quarter of the land, while the peasant majority struggled with overcrowded plots. Many peasants had no other choice but to get into seasonal labor, factory work, or migration to cities and frontier regions. In 1892, Friedrich Engels, writing under an alias to Marx's old Russian revolutionary contact, Nikolai Danielson, observed that if the, quote, Russian peasant is destined to eventually transform into an industrial or agricultural proletarian, then the Russian landowner, it seems, is likewise doomed to ruin. As far as I am aware, this class of landowners is burdened with debt to an even greater extent than the peasantry and is compelled to sell off its assets piecemeal. Recently, a new class of landowners has apparently been squeezing in between these two estates. Rural kulaks and urban petty bourgeois who are perhaps destined to become the progenitors of a future Russian landed aristocracy. Strip farming, village communes, and antiquated agricultural methods made peasant life especially difficult. Fields were often divided into narrow strips scattered across communal land. Productivity stayed low, and harvests depended heavily on rain, making crop failures commonplace, spiraling into famines that killed millions of people. The famine of 1891 to 1892 exposed the weakness of the rural economy and helped discredit the imperial state. It also exposed the woefully corrupt church, whose power had waned in the minds of the peasantry. Both working class and populist anti-Tsarist resistance saw major reaction by the clergy's Black Hundreds activities, which led to many among the people to start turning away from the church. As a result, wrote one priest, quote, the people's feelings towards the church have grown very cold, and they view us as parasites, more like people who have sold out the interests of the religion to the interests of the bureaucracy, and are therefore harmful to the people. Before the days of freedom, before 1905, the relationship between pastor and flock could be considered tolerable, wrote one priest from the Vladimir province. There was no talk of unbelief in the village. Now, however, it is rare to find a parish that does not have a denier. While corruption was commonplace in the countryside, the bureaucracy at all levels was so laden with nepotism, bribery, and internal feuds that it was difficult for the emperor himself to even direct orders. Russian society was also legally divided by the Soslovie estate system, which classified people into hereditary social estates such as nobility, clergy, townspeople, and peasants. Within the peasantry, there were major variations. Prosperous kulaks owned more land, livestock, or equipment, while the poor majority lived near subsistence. The fertile south differed sharply from the poorer northern regions. This imbalance, both on the individual scale and nationwide, caused a deep strain upon the people. The Tsar's Prime Minister, Alexander Stolypin, in response to, quote, massive agrarian unrest of 1905 to 1906, passed the Edict of November 1906 and the laws of June 1910 and May 1911, which marked a resolute effort on the part of the government to increase peasant respect for private property, not least the land belonging to the gentry. Yet, in spite of the majority's desire to retain control of collective resources, what the implementation of the reforms revealed was not so much the communalism of the village as the deep fissures that ran through it. Repartitions had always involved winners and losers. The population grew, but the arable land did not. Subsequently, those strips were subdivided with each generation until they could no longer feed the families tied to them. Barely 1.5% of the population, comprised of the nobility and the crown, still held a quarter of all the farmland. Much of it rented back to the same peasants at whatever their desperation would pay. And when the harvest failed, as it did catastrophically in 1891, the result was mass starvation. A high infant mortality rate meant the average peasant's life expectancy was exceptionally low. Yet Russia's population grew so quickly In the latter half of the 19th century, arable land per household fell over 20% between 1877 and 1905. And even though by 1913, Russia had, quote, become the world's leading grain exporter, crop yield was only slightly more than two-thirds of that of its nearest rivals, Argentina, USA, and Canada. The powder keg of rapidly changing geopolitical conditions and exploding population growth saw, quote, the tempo increased even further to produce a population of 122 million by 1913. To complicate matters, urban industry employed not much more than 5% of the entire labor force and contributed only about 1/5 of the national income. Yet the Tsarist government's encouragement of heavy industry necessarily entailed the sacrifice of rural interests. It was, quote, in the last resort the peasantry who had to pay far beyond their resources for the development of industry, which nevertheless, far from bringing benefit to the mass of Russians, actively contributed to their impoverishment. This bourgeois Malthusian approach to reforming agricultural and technological backwardness, coupled with the harshness of Russian conditions, meant that calculated loss of life in the countryside was almost an expected part of Tsarist Russia society. And, quote, peasant surpluses remained small owing to the severe winters, harvests remained unpredictable. Apart from the famine of 1891, there were failed harvests in 1901, 1906, and 1911, so the threat to subsistence remained all too real. Out of the squeeze, the village itself began to divide between richer peasants, the kulaks, who rented extra land and lent grain at ruinous interests, and the masses below them, who owned almost nothing, and lived by selling their labor to whoever would take it. It was out of this crippling situation that a burgeoning resentment grew across Russia's vast agricultural regions. But things were not better in the cities. Increasing antagonism in the vast countryside and its inevitable reverberation in the city was once highlighted by leading Soviet historian Mikhail Pokrovsky in 1924 in Pravda. Quote, it is difficult to find a better example of historical dialectics. A landowner's estate calls into being a railroad in order to reach the most profitable, widest European Russian market. The railroad will give birth to metallurgy. Metallurgy will create the most revolutionary detachment of the proletariat, burying the great-grandfather of the entire system, the landed estate. In the final decades of Tsarist rule, Russia experienced highly uneven industrialization. Under Sergei Witte, Russia's Minister of Finance in the 1890s, the state pushed a policy of forced economic modernization through protective tariffs, foreign loans, foreign investment, railway construction, and support for heavy industry. Russian industrial growth was extremely fast in some pre-1914 measures, especially compared with its own backward starting point. But the empire still lagged far behind Britain, Germany, and France in overall industrial development. Coal, oil, steel, iron, and railways expanded dramatically. Oil production around Baku, coal mining in the Donbass, steel production in the Ukraine, in Poland. The railway expansion helped create a burgeoning industrial sector. By the early 20th century, Russia had millions of wage laborers. Cities grew quickly as peasants left villages to seek wages in the factories, accelerating proletarization. This industrial boom produced miserable conditions for this nascent working class. Workers often faced long hours, long wages, dangerous machinery, poor sanitation, overcrowded housing, and harsh factory discipline. Child labor remained part of the industrial labor system, and many workers lived in cramped barracks or apartments where disease spread easily. The new urban working class was therefore concentrated, angry, and politically volatile. Peasant migrants brought rural grievances into the cities, while factory life introduced them to strikes, unions, illegal political circles, and collective action. Strike waves became more common after World War I, especially after the 1905 revolution. Tsarist Russia was a vast, multinational empire, forged over centuries of civilizational conflicts and expansions. Westward into the Baltics and Poland, southward into the Caucasus and Central Asia, incorporating dozens of peoples and enormous natural resources. By the early 20th century, the empire stretched from the border of Germany to the Pacific Ocean, ruling over more than 100 nationalities. While this created a colossal state with immense potential, it also became what Lenin called a prison of nations. Non-Russian peoples frequently faced policies of Russification, cultural suppression, and economic exploitation to maintain centralized autocratic control. To hold this huge empire together and pursue further imperialist goals, the Tsars maintained the world's largest standing army. Russia joined the Triple Entente and promoted pan-Slavism in the Balkans. Yet the military was deeply flawed, with outdated equipment, aristocratic incompetence, and weak infrastructure. Furthermore, quote, the notion that the war was a senseless massacre predominated within the peasant consciousness. They believed that the only rational explanation for the war was that it was a mechanism to solve the land issue. Already in December 1914, long before the start of the series of Russian military failures, peasants who were gathered at a Tomsk artel shop to make purchases reasoned as follows. Do you think that this war is being pursued for the sake of our interests? No, it's nothing of the kind. Emperor Nicholas and German Wilhelm continued to drink champagne together, as they used to. The war is being fought in order to destroy millions of decent people. And as history shows, the greatest burden fell on the peasants, with forced conscription that ripped millions of young men from their villages for long years of service. Families lost essential labor, forcing them to neglect or abandon parts of their already insufficient land strips and deepening rural poverty and resentment. Stephen A. Smith writes that, quote, in reality, the uncertainties of war and revolution had the short-term effect of rallying different strata of the village around the commune. The one institution they knew would be relied upon to minimize risk to collective security. It is thus likely that the commune did act to slow the process of social differentiation, yet it never served to iron out social inequalities. It embodied, rather than diminished, divisions within the rural community between rich and poor, between young and old, and between insiders and outsiders. It was the fact that the overwhelming majority of peasants did not recognize the legitimacy of gentry-owned land that proved critical. This extreme chasm between rural peasantry, underdeveloped urban industry, and the decadent aristocratic capitalist minority lording over both had resulted in the historical irony once more highlighted by Pokrovsky. It seemed the most obvious truth that socialism could come to us only after Western Europe and America. Thus Western Europe simply would not allow any other path besides everything else. With the intellectual's characteristically formal approach to matters, we failed to understand that in our revolution, the masses fight not for form, but for content, not for labels, but for genuine reality, for land, for class power, not for constitutional articles. And once power is seized, the victorious class will be able to clothe it in articles. But that's a matter of secondary importance. While in exile, Lenin analyzed these conditions deeply. In his writings on the development of capitalism in Russia, published in 1899, he saw a backward agrarian economy riddled with semi-feudal conditions, from land hunger, redemption payouts, strip farming, and peasant misery alongside emerging capitalist relations. The Tsarist autocracy acted as a superstructure protecting elite interests while brutally exploiting the growing proletariat in factories and oppressing nationalities. This contradiction intensified with the failing reforms of 1905, and continued imperialist adventures, like the Japanese War, further exposed the Russian Empire's weakness. Lenin's scientific analysis of imperialism revealed that in the epoch of monopoly capitalism, the chain of world imperialism would break at its weakest link. Tsarist Russia was burdened with semi-feudal backwardness in the countryside, a highly concentrated and militant proletariat in modern industry, ethnic conflict, and a degenerating autocracy. With this new understanding, Lenin forged the Bolsheviks into a disciplined vanguard party of professional revolutionaries. As he outlined in What is to be Done, the working class could not spontaneously develop full socialist consciousness through economic struggle alone. Rather, it required a conscious, centralized leadership, capable of bringing revolutionary theory to the masses and directing the struggle. This vanguard would lead the proletariat in firm alliance with the poor peasants, pushing beyond the limits of bourgeois democratic revolution towards socialist revolution. Lenin wrote in 1914, only a few months before World War I, quote, "Our liberals refuse to admit that serf economy is still practiced on a vast scale in the Russian countryside to this day. Serfdom lives on, for when the semi-pauper peasant, held in bondage by means of money loans or the renting of land, works for the landlord with his wretched horse and implements, we have here the economic essence of serf economy." Lenin could also see that there existed an instinct and material momentum among the masses, and the party's concentrated efforts were needed to help organize their common aims and win victory. Such cosmic shifts were in reality the plodding slow changes in social habits and the manner in which the people related to everyday life. These basic uncurtailed political slogans were the three veils of Russian cosmogony, made as approachable and straightforward demands for the unruly behemoth nation kept in thrall by Germanized monarchy. Quote, "The Democratic Republic, confiscation of all landed estates, and an 8-hour day." To win these basic demands, a confrontation with the Leviathan lay ahead of the Russian masses. Civil war was inevitable. The first known German translation of Marx's Capital was in Russian, and Marx observed in several places that Russians had always been his faithful patrons. Yet he himself had long taken a somewhat dismissive or skeptical view of such ironies. However, by 1879, Marx admitted in a recently discovered letter, quote, "My belief is that revolution, in its explosive form, will be set off this time not from the West, but from the East, from Russia." Engels also made this uncanny prediction in 1893 regarding Russia's revolutionary potential, once again writing to Danielson, quote, "A great nation like yours will survive any crisis. There is no great historical disaster that has not been counterbalanced and rewarded by some form of historical progress. Only the way of doing things is constantly changing. Let destiny be fulfilled." The Great October Socialist Revolution of 1917, led by Lenin and the Bolshevik Party, smashed the Tsarist autocracy and landlord capitalist rule. One of the first acts of the new Soviet power was the decree on land, which transferred all landlords' estates to the peasants. Russia, in middle of 1917, was the most heavily indebted country in the world, owing France alone around 4 billion francs. When the Bolsheviks came to power, they immediately cancelled all Tsarist debts, repudiating billions in loans owed to foreign capitalists, freeing the young Soviet state from the chains of international finance capital. Imperialist powers did not accept this challenge to their system. 14 capitalist countries, including Britain, France, the United States, Japan, and others, invaded Soviet Russia, supporting white counter-revolutionary armies in a brutal attempt to strangle the world's first socialist state in its cradle. Despite immense hardship, economic blockade, and foreign invasion, the Soviet people under Lenin's leadership defeated the interventionists and internal counter-revolution through the heroic Red Army and the alliance of workers and peasants. After Lenin's death, under the watch of Stalin, the socialist industrialization drive and the five-year plans rapidly transformed the backward agrarian country into a modern industrial power. Collectivization smashed kulak resistance. It mechanized agriculture and secured the food supply. Literacy campaigns, universal education, women's full emancipation, and the brotherhood of nations within the USSR attacked and overcame centuries of Tsarist backwardness. Under Soviet power, electricity reached the most remote villages. Universal education was now a reality, and the formerly exploited masses gained culture, dignity, and a conscious role in building the new society. From a backward, semi-feudal country ruined by war and intervention, the Soviet Union transformed itself into an industrial and military superpower in a single generation. It was the Soviet people, guided by Marxism-Leninism, who crushed fascist barbarianism in the Great Patriotic War, liberated Eastern Europe from Nazi occupation, and became a direct challenger to the United States' imperialist hegemonic system.
If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing to see more from us. To support us directly, check out our Patreon. The link is in the description.